go home once in a while and see them.
It's a long flight for you.
You're the only person in your family here?
Yeah, I'm actually not American either, by citizenship. I've been here for a while. I came here for college and then, but I went to British schools growing up. And so that's why I speak English, but my parents don't speak English at all. So it's kind of a good thing because it's a free pass for me to write what I want to write and they're not going to read it. So.
Okay, I won't get into that. They might get it. Is it translated at all?
It's not translated into Japanese. It might be a little bit controversial. That could be part of it. So that's maybe part of it.
No, yeah. I can see that clearly.
Yeah, I mean, the book will land very differently over there, and it was written to kind of push against these sort of official narratives. And so I think, I don't know, we'll see what happens.
Right. It's how we deal with history.
Right. Yeah. And, my mother actually used a dictionary and really struggled to read the first story in the collection, which really was just so touching to me, that she really tried. And I think it took her like a month to read it, but she did. And I mean, it was just incredible because they don't really know much about my sort of what I do. They know that I wrote a book, so, yeah.
Well, yes. I'm wondering if everyone is here who's going to be here for the moment. There was a problem I noticed in the announcement, and the problem was the date. I don't know. Oh, you noticed that too, Asako?
No, I don't know.
Okay, when I sent it out, I think it had the 24th, but on the calendar it had the correct date. So that might have been a little bit confusing to some people. And I noticed that there are a few people missing, so I hope that that's not the case. But Asako, understand that we video this.
Okay.
So people who aren't here will have a chance to see it. And those of you who do know me, please excuse the fact that I'm dealing with allergies.
Oh.
There's a pear tree right outside here. That's my nemesis. So my voice can come and go a little bit. I think Chuck knows that. You all know each other, right? Except Asako.
I'm acquainted with most of you, yes, but this is really thrilling to have the author here, and I'm slow to pick up. That's what this is all about, to hear from the author, because you're obviously brilliant.
That's exactly what it's about.
Yes.
Because the stories are so wonderful, and I feel so honored to have them in my anthology, because each story is just so unique and wonderful, and the authors are wonderful. And I think actually, having read the Inheritors, I would say Asako's work might take a whole semester to go over. we won't do that. We don't have time for that today. But I'll just say a little bit about her and we can get started because it's a little bit later. Asako, understand that we can go over the time just a bit if you need to.
Yeah.
Okay, Asako Serizawa was born in Japan and raised in Singapore, Jakarta, and Tokyo. Her debut book of fiction, Inheritors. Oh, sorry, that's my book. This one. Won the PEN Open Book Award and the Story Prize Spotlight Award, was a Massachusetts Book Awards Honors Book, and was longlisted for the PEN Robert W. Bingham Prize. A recipient of grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Mass Cultural Council, her work has also been awarded 2 O. Henry Prizes, a Pushcart Prize, Arona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, and fellowships from the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, McDowell, Civitella, Rainier Foundation, and elsewhere. And she lives in Boston. And her story, Echolocation, is in What's Next, and that's what we'll talk about today. So now you can explain in a couple of minutes what this work is.
Okay, so the collection itself, so this is part of a larger collection of stories, and the collection is sort of interlinked stories that span about 5 generations of a Japanese family that's been scattered by World War II, and it spans about a century to look at sort of the roots and the ripple effects of World War II. And one of the core themes is sort of this idea of technology and science and how this has affected the world. So, war being part of something that also, is very much rooted in scientific and technological advancement. And so one of the core themes of the collection is this idea of the 17th century Enlightenment project, this project to try to get civilization out of the Dark Ages into a better, more sort of regulated, advanced, rational world that's governed less by chance and superstition and myths, but by something more grounded, with some kind of systematic methodology that's like grounded in something maybe empirical, and so it's this whole thing that sort of privileged science and rationality, especially sort of empirical science, which privileges the ocular, like the sight, in the production of knowledge. So how we understand our world and ourselves, and this kind of instrumental reason that serves the notion of progress, all of progress with a capital P, this sort of idea that we'll keep advancing and progressing and things are going to get better and better in certain ways, all of which we're still sort of familiar with. And but then, there's obviously like the shadow side of the Enlightenment project, which is this kind of idea of this world divided into the primitive and the civilized, and the inferior and the superior, the backwards and the advanced, the pagan and the enlightened, all this kind of this notion that underpinned Western imperialism and the colonial enterprise in the so-called dark parts of the world. And World War II, from my perspective, is part of this sort of trajectory, this consequent trajectory that's rooted in the Enlightenment project. And it's an expression of what happens when, the tools meant to better the world and advance humanity turns into this weapon of domination and control to serve one group's interests. So this is sort of like one of the core themes that's kind of laced through the whole collection. And the stories explore this from myriad perspectives across historical time and across the generations. And echolocation comes at the very end of the collection, literally to pose these questions about the course of humanity, where we seem to be headed towards, and really the meaning and value of, of human civilization itself. Like, what is our life worth? And so we have a story in which there's a main character, Mai, who exists in this sort of postmodern information age where she's surrounded by a swirl of information, whether that's Wikipedia, news articles, voices and opinions of the adults around her, her brother, and she lives in this kind of unstable, shifting world, that she kind of half understands, and she has this enormous task of trying to take in and process and assemble meaning out of it all, to try to understand not just what's happening in the world, but sort of what's happening to her herself, and she's kind of besieged by this like free-floating anxiety that alights on different things, like the father's like travel in this airplane and her worries around the airplanes, what could happen, or her aunt Katie's fridge, which she symbolizes to her this thing of like, the aunt's out of touchness with like the doom that's coming, this sort of thing. And so while she's assembling these different pieces, the story also, I think, tries to ask the readers to assemble the pieces and piece together what's happening to my, you know, what her anxieties are about. And it uses this sort of dramatic irony to kind of, you know, stage the character at, you know, and position the reader in where the reader sort of knows more than the character that's on stage. And so that's sort of how that was set up. And I guess that's sort of what I'll say about that.
There's a lot more to say.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we put this in context with the rest of the book? It starts before World War II.
Yes.
Okay, so let's give a little bit of that. It's a family history on one level.
Yes.
But I have a feeling that the family history is used not to be factual, shall we say, but as an expression of a lot of those ideas that you just brought up. They're also, the stories don't seem to be in chronological order.
Right.
So you get certain parts of the story, and as you said, the reader is beginning to catch on to what this is all about. I think one of the stories, toward the end, I'm sorry that I don't, the garden. Oh no,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the one before.
Yeah, that's the garden. Yeah.
Yes, but Pavilion also brings together a lot of the questions that might have been asked up to that point about these two adopted and not adopted brothers. So we get some of the story there, but we also get a lot more information about what you just brought up. I'm just putting this in some sort of a context because it might be a little bit difficult to understand echolocation without knowing what the rest of the book is, how the rest of the book leads up to that. Okay, is there anything you'd like to say about that, how that works?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the stories are meant to be autonomous. So I think you're right. I think the rest of the book will layer in, like there's this moment where this one of the Japanese soldiers, like so there's this kaiten thing that is mentioned in the story where like it's basically this torpedo style or I guess it's a manned torpedo. So it's a human being that goes into the torpedo, and this is being used in the war as a suicide sort of mission. And in the course of the book, for example, you learn that the person inside of this kaiten may be one of an unknown relative, you know, of the kids. So there are other things that kind of play a role, but yeah, right. So there is a family tree at the spine of the book, and these are very different family members who are scattered. So some of the members of the family don't know each other, and you know, war has this fracturing effect. So it's kind of a broken or fractured tree, family tree that's in the spine of the book, and it's not linear. And so actually the second to last story is set further in the future than echolocation. But I wanted to end with questions because ultimately for me, I'm more interested in the transition point, you know, in a character's life where characters and us, we might have agency still to do something about something, you know. And so if you've set it in the future, even if it's like if it's sort of like, you know, Cormac McCarthy's The Road situation where the apocalypse has already happened, it kind of, you know, on the one hand, it's dreadful what happens, you know, that the envisioned future, but at the same time, it's comforting because it means that humanity has somehow survived. And so for me, it's kind of like wanting to put characters at that juncture, you know, where we don't know the future, but we can kind of foresee one type of future, you know, but we still have agency to act upon it. So all of these also take up this idea of, you know, where human agency might lie, and what we might do about it. And so I think echolocation has its own sort of, you know, wrestling with these questions.
Yes. Does anyone else have a question or comment so far? Everyone's quiet.
Well, I sense the anxiety of this little girl and also the brilliance, but and I worry about children today. And I understand parents are, couples could be parents who are choosing not to raise children in this screwed up and scary world. I don't know. But a lot of mentions of climate change and mention that the earth is going to be extinct in billions of years, or not extinct, but I don't know, burn up or there's
We will be extinct.
anxiety throughout it, worrying that she's going to go blind and I'm worrying about her father and in the plane. I don't know. It warrants 2 or 3 readings, I think, but yeah, you said there's optimism. There's still room for change. She's recognizing these things that we can be aware of regarding climate change, for instance, I guess.
Is there optimism though?
Yeah, I wondered about that.
Because to me, it's very, oh my God, it's very full of angst and despair. And I feel, you wish you could help this young girl somehow get counseling of some sort so she can cope without spinning off and leaving the universe or something like that. It's very terrifying to me. And
a lot of our world these days is terrifying. I think kids are receptive,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're perceptive.
She's super sharp because she picks up on things that her mother and father make eye contact. They do this, that, the other. And she's very observant about the here and now situation, like with the shoes and her Aunt Katie's place and everything like that. But her mind, she lives in her mind to such a large degree and speculating of the what ifs and what can happen, and which I tend to do too. And again, be very, very depressing to focus. You have to be able to focus, I guess I'm learning, on the here and now and find what Charlie Chaplin said, find the humor in everything somehow, but it's kind of hard to find the humor in this story that we're watching right now. I wish you would have registered voter in the United States so you could vote.
Yeah, it's true.
Plug your nose and vote.
Yeah, it's spiraling out of control here too.
Yes.
But, and then there was an interesting thing. I have a question about the click language that you bring up. Wasn't there a wonderful singer? Was it Miriam Makeba?
Miriam Makeba, yes.
Used to do that. It was an amazing vocal thing she was able to do because she came from a certain tribe in Africa somewhere that communicates this way with the clicks. And you brought that into the story. Could you tell us about that?
It was more sort of like, because I think that ultimately, I don't know if it's hopeful either at the end, but one thing is sort of, trying to, this child and supposedly us, we're trying to figure out maybe new ways of perceiving and understanding the world, because here's a world that's been where looking is not necessarily seeing, and seeing is not necessarily understanding or knowing, so all of these things that are a string that should be strung together. So like looking should be the same as seeing, and seeing should like help us know and understand the world. All of these different junctures have broken down. And so in some ways she's trying to figure out a new way of understanding the world, that's not joined to this sort of Enlightenment thinking where, it's so ocular. It's so much about knowing it's so much about the sight and like empirical evidence, and this is how we know the world. And here's this girl who's trying to figure out a new way of, new methods. So like other methods like echolocation or the clicking or, these other kinds of processing or of information, and so it's kind of like more about listening. So clicks might mean nothing to like in an Enlightenment framework, but outside of it, or for this girl anyway, this is making more sense. It's another way to understand the world and to really listen rather than, looking and immediately acting, this sort of thing. And so it was kind of an exploration of that, like what alternative methods of knowing and understanding is there? How can we understand the world differently? And how can we assemble information in a different way based on this new or alternative method that involves more listening and, you know, understanding like these clicks or other things that may not make sense rationally can still, you know, make sense emotionally, or some other way of experiencing and connecting with the world that's kind of breaking down and not making sense anymore.
No, that does. You know, you bring in a lot of ways of thinking and seeing, and you also bring in Eastern philosophy to some degree. You bring in Taoism and Buddhism, and I'm wondering if you, how does that fit? I have here a little dog who's going crazy. If you can hear him. You can't hear him? Okay, I'm glad you can't. Okay. I think someone set the door. Tamarah, please get rid of this in the video.
It never happened.
I have one question that kind of ties in with what Sharyn just raised about the Buddhism and so on. The term itself, echolocation, was so interesting because at the end of the book, when all these questions, is anyone else out there? Will they find us? It's like, what is an echo? You send it out, and it's back at you. So everything she is projecting is coming back at her. And tie in with the aloneness of nothingness, or I don't know, just asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how I was kind of thinking too, you know, that she is sending out her signals, or maybe humanity's sending out these signals, but we don't know if it's coming back, and how long are we gonna, you know, send out signals that make sense, you know, because in the end, there is human existence, there's humanity, and we could be gone, we might leave artifacts, but in the end, it seems to me that storytelling or narratives are what kind of grounds human existence or tells that story. Without stories, I feel that even if you have artifacts, like there's nothing to say about that. You know, what kind of evidence is that? You know, you need stories to kind of understand what humanity was about, or what a life was about, you know, and these things are kind of perilous, you know, hanging in the balance, you know, with all of these changes and the way that the world seems to be going. And I think the Buddhism, this is more sort of a question that Pavilion, another story, sort of explores, but I think that's sort of set against the Enlightenment project. So Eastern Enlightenment being different than Western the idea of Western Enlightenment. And I think in this story, we kind of get some part of this that's been more of a popularized sort of New Age version that we get through the Jackie character, who, and I guess the yoga teacher too, where, you know, they're both kind of trying to embrace this mindfulness, or, you know, this kind of more New Age take on these philosophies, you know, as another way of making sense of the world, and maybe, I don't know, an alternative way of being than, you know, sort of like a instrumental, you know, mentality where like, okay, what can we do to gain this or that, or what can we do to, like, you know, get our interests met, you know, which I think the dad sort of symbolizes. I mean, he's not a bad person, but he's certainly locked into a particular value system and worldview, you know, where, you know, he's a pharmaceutical representative, you know, and he doesn't see eye to eye with, you know, her mother, who's an academic, trying to grapple with these questions, and he doesn't see eye to eye with this New Age character, who also is trying to grapple with these questions in her own way. And, you know, this poor child is trying to navigate all of these different perspectives to come up with her own way of, I guess, survival, you know, because in the end, I think for me anyway, her anxieties are rooted in something very existential.
I think what you bring up is something, but just so that you're aware, there are three of us, I think there are three of us here who are Buddhists.
Okay.
And there is an issue, I can't speak for the others, but there is an issue with the mindfulness movement and with Buddhism, because the mindfulness movement is kind of a westernized relax yourself, feel good movement.
Right.
And it really doesn't have much to do with the context, or put in the context of what Buddhism really is.
Yeah.
Now, extending that a little bit, those of us who are Western Buddhists also have to live here. So we have this conflict with what you're saying, this conflict of living here in a Western world that has Western values, and also trying to find some way to fit in those Buddhist values.
Right.
So this is something that goes on, that I felt in this story. Not in all of them, because I just want to point out to those of you who aren't, this is not necessarily, Buddhist book as I read it, but it does bring up some of those questions of how do you bring together all these disparate philosophies,
Right.
concepts that are just floating in the world, like airplanes, all of these things. How do you bring them all together and make something out of them? For, that's why I have it in the book, What's Next? Because what happens after? How do you figure it out? Did you figure it out, Asako?
I think, I mean, this is so the collection as a whole sort of takes up this historical period, and then sort of puts it in a larger context. And one of the questions whenever I feel like I'm engaging in something historical is, not just the roots and the ripple effects, but sort of like, me as a writer, like, why am I looking at this history from my point of view at the present? So, as a Japanese writer writing in English, living in the US, like in the 21st century, what can I bring to this subject? Like, what can I do? Or how can I explore it, in a way that sort of speaks to something current, not to necessarily, impose something from the present onto the past, but sort of seeing from my vantage, like, what can I see about this history, and like, how can this sort of make sense in our context? Like, what can we understand about our current context? And so, I think it's absolutely true. Like, I think, bringing together all of these different philosophies and seeing where these philosophies are in these contexts today, because I am writing from a sort of transnational or diasporic perspective. And so, I'm kind of writing from this liminal sort of in-between space, and there is a certain kind of power to that advantage, because I get to kind of see, I'm not bound by like a particular border, for example, I can kind of, I do want to look at this from a kaleidoscopic perspective, like where you turn the kaleidoscope and like the different stories might articulate in a different way and form a different pattern, and so it's kind of like that, like how did these things all assemble? And I mean, in this one, it happens so that it's set in 2024. When I wrote this was, I don't know, 8 years or 9 years back, and so it was not the same world as it is today, and so here it is. And actually, the one that's set even further in the future, I think it's in the 2030s. I don't know, this was pre-pandemic when I wrote that story. And so here is a world that's kind of mirroring it in this particular way. And on the one hand, I think, it's scary, but on the other hand, I think that, if I had known that the pandemic was coming, I think that story would have been different too, and so anyway, it's interesting that echolocation happened to be set this year, but it was written in the past, and so hopefully it's speaking to something, the state of these worldviews, clashing worldviews, or interlocking ones, that are present today.
It's interesting that the way you describe yourself as with your worldview as transnational, but when I read this, I felt something of a kaleidoscope too. I happen to like kaleidoscopes for this reason. And it really has to do with the way we get information.
Yeah.
You have in this story Wikipedia, you have the child's viewpoint, you have questions that almost seem to be do seem to be beyond what she might be thinking as a child. You have all kinds of things here coming at us, the way information comes at us during the day. And the question is, to me, how do you make wisdom out of that? How do you put it all together and make something out of it that makes sense?
Mhm.
That's your question.
Right, right. And I
When
think
you
that,
say who would write our, who will tell our story? To me, a story would be something that's cohesive, something that you can say, well, this is the way I put it all together. This is the way this narrative makes sense to me. This is the way all this floating information suddenly comes together. And now I know what the world is. Do we ever get to that point? I'm not sure.
In this information age, probably not.
Yes.
You know, for me, when I was reading this, right now I'm doing a study of just verse versus prose because I work in poetry. And the differences that both of them are utilized in literature. And so naturally I would go to Shakespeare. And so my favorite use is Hamlet. And the
Oh, no.
You
You
froze,
froze.
Tamara.
what?
You're back. You're
You
back.
froze for a minute.
I thought you were talking about prose, and I'm like, I'm so excited.
The last 30 seconds or less, you froze.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
So,
fantastic.
so just go back to what you were saying.
I'm on an island and we have island connection out here. So I was talking about Hamlet and his use of verse and prose. And so of course you already know this. But when he's using verse, it is when he's speaking to authorities. Claudius
Mhm.
always speaks in verse, and that is the purchase of the narrative. And when the prose is used, it's for the common man, but it's also it's unstable ground, and it's to propel the narrative of the story. And so when I was reading this, I'm like, oh, I can see what you're doing because the structure is so ancient. And that's actually, from my perspective, when I read this, I actually read it as such an ancient story because how, what story are we not looking for answers? What does it mean? What are we doing? There's so many things going on around us. And how does that affect our lives? Where is our family when we are separated through events or circumstances? And so when I'm reading this, I'm like, such an ancient story with modern motifs that we can understand. And it's like if we're reading Shakespeare, we're like, it's fine, but it's also very old. And so we disassociate ourselves with the story because it was the story of another time. But with this, we're like, oh, I know exactly how this feels. And when your family is apart. And so what I really appreciated was the steady use of the structure that you had, because it was as a location, as Stephanie was saying earlier, is you are calling out to find answers. And where is the purchase? Like, where do we make contact? And sometimes it's through inanimate information. And those are the liminal forms of communication, is letters or emails or texts or, or or Wikipedia. It's like those are completely separate from the personal information where we're asking, Aunt Kathy, or we're asking Aaron. It's like, what are we doing at the very end? That's where we end, is we can't ask the things around us. We have to ask the people that are at least around us. So that is the human connection that is so necessary for these ancient stories. So if I had a question, I would be, it's like, how did you pace the structure? Because you can have big pieces, you can have little, like, I don't know how I would have done it. I would have structured it like a poem because that's what I know. But it's like, how did you feel about the structure?
So I think for me, structure and form is such a big part of writing. I think these days you learn how to write a particular kind of story form, and then you kind of fit whatever you can in it. But for me, it's kind of like, the form is sort of like a window, with different shapes, or frame of a photograph, so it depends on like what the form will allow into the story. So this was a challenge in a sense, because I wanted to ask these, as you were saying, like this large question that's sort of timeless in this way of, I think no human hasn't asked these existential questions about existential things, and so it is, so that was, but then how does it manifest today? And I think that the form was sort of part of this. And actually, this form is an echo of another thing that another story that begins the whole collection, and it's called Flight. And really, it spans a whole lifetime of a woman who basically at the end of her life has kind of dementia or Alzheimer's. And it's this kind of her contending with her personal history. And all of these memories are kind of floating up, and this one is, so echolocation is linear in time-wise, but the other one is sort of, it's not linear at all, and it kind of just sort of pops up, and then it kind of comes together, and so this story is kind of a rhyming or an echo of that particular structure, where for the woman, it's like the memories that become like the information that's floating around her head, that she has to kind of come to terms with and assemble and kind of make sense of her life and her identity. And here is this child who is also in a similar state, but instead of these memories, because she's so young still, it's also the swirl of information that she's trying to assemble. And so I was thinking about sort of that, and how do we kind of make sense of all of this sort of layers and clashing information, and so trying to write a linear kind of story was just not working. I mean, how do you kind of get the feel of that, because again, the story is less about the author coming in and assembling the story. It's more like, here is all of this information. I mean, obviously I'm selective, but it's this idea that it's trying to mirror the character's experience, at the experiential level, how it might feel for a child, to kind of have all of this information swirling around. And so that was kind of how I envisioned it. So in this instance, the form and structure had a lot to do with the experiential dimension of this character, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
In other
I
ones,
think you should mention too that throughout the book you use different forms.
Yeah.
The story, the stories are in different forms. Some are sort of like logs or diaries. In other words, they have dates and times. Others are more segmented. They have blocks of information.
Right.
Fictional information. They're all different. Also, you do have a little bit of genre changes.
Yeah.
Because you have the story that you mentioned. I think it's The Garden. I think is a little bit more science fiction.
Right.
So there are mixes of stories in this book, and to me, echolocation kind of brings them together very nicely.
Yeah, and yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
Stephanie?
No, go ahead, please. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's fine.
No, I was just going to bring up the question of as a person who's a fan of the Dalai Lama and the purpose of life is happiness, where is the happiness in the book? And it seems that it resides a little bit with Katie. If there's no food in the fridge, she just off you go to the grocery store. You know, and there's a joie de vivre. There's a feeling of aliveness there, of being in the moment, and that doesn't, you know, and all the questioning and everything that she's going to go back and forth that the child is doing. How does she reacting to the moment she's in, or does she react much to the moment she's in? Except by asking questions. Does she experience any happiness or joy as a child?
She loved the closet, the shoes, and she
That's
liked to
right,
organize
yeah.
them. Yeah.
Mhm.
And she liked it. I think she was amused by her brother who was going through puberty, you know. Yeah.
Actually, yes, I have to say, until I got to echolocation, I was wondering, where's the humor here? And it certainly comes out just as Sally is saying, in those childish interactions.
Mhm.
Have a typical sister-brother relationship, older brother, younger sister relationship.
Yes. Yes, it does. I think happiness is in Buddhism is a different conversation.
Mhm.
So I mean, that too can go on. Like, what is it and how do we define it? If it can be. So that's a different conversation, but yes, maybe that's what they're striving for. I don't know if it's happiness, maybe it's understanding or just making sense of
Yeah,
things.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
That might bring some of the happiness that you're describing. It's just being able to understand, what is this life I'm embodied in.
So
What-
there's a
what is-
line from the play Tea House of the August Moon that the main character says in the beginning of the play, I believe, is pain makes man think, thought makes man wise, and wisdom makes life endurable. You know, and just
Well,
sort of
yes,
reminds me of that. Yeah.
that's why I was asking, how do you get to wisdom from all of these disparate things coming in? How do you do that? And that seems to be the question that I get from this last story. I don't know if it's the only question in the book. I want to say, though, putting it in context again, you have these cycles of generations that kind of flip back and forward throughout the collection. And with that, I just wondering, you bring up this is a little point, but you bring up you mentioned reincarnation a couple of times. And I'm just wondering if because I know that you're a very careful writer, and I don't think you would have put that there for no reason. So I'm just asking, is there some reason for mentioning that with these cycles of generations that seem to, in their own way, echo?
Excuse me. I think it's more a question of cycles of violence, or like these sorry, these
okay,
yeah, maybe I'll take some water.
Right.
Sorry.
Not a problem.
I think yeah, I think it's more sort of like, you know, this idea of cycles of violence or cycles of history sort of repeating, you know. And so in one of the stories, like, you know, that person's understanding of that sort of cycle is interlinked with something more Buddhist, you know, or something more Taoist about sort of like the reincarnation cycles, you know, and sort of like coming back and finishing or not finishing, or the karma, like that type of logic, you know. And not all the characters sort of take on that viewpoint. But certainly I think the larger collection asks this question about, like, you know, the cycles that repeat over the generations, and like where are these points at which we might be able to intervene, you know, like where is individual agency and how can we intervene in this or not, you know, and also like what are the mechanisms that force this kind of cycle to perpetuate itself, because World War II was so horrendous, you know, and people suffer. Wars go on, you know, all of these things keep happening, genocides keep happening, you know, all of this stuff, and yet it keeps repeating in different forms, you know. And one thing is to understand the particularities of history, you know, not to collapse all of these different things. But on the other hand, it, you know, it seems that people don't quite get out of this cycle in one way or the other, you know. And so the question is, why is that, and what can we do about it? And so it's kind of more of a larger abstract questions around that is filtered through that particular story, through this idea of reincarnation, because I think it's a similar adjacent parallel kind of question.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I realized that not all the characters followed that. There was one character who went to her father's funeral and forgot part of the ritual. So that was pretty obvious that she had drifted away. So yes, that was clear to me. Anyone else want to say something? I think there are some people here who might be thinking something. Chuck?
Oh, I'm just absorbing all of this. It's brilliant and provocative and making me think about history and World War II, in a Western vision of the world as opposed to an Eastern vision of the world, with your references to Taoism and Buddhism. So I'm still processing, but thank you for so many, you know, stimulating ideas.
Indeed. Thank you.
Just to clarify, then this is part of the book Inheritors?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess, I mean,
it's very well awarded.
I read yes.
I guess one thing I could say about the form of it too, you know, a lot of the stories also, because Sharyn, you were mentioning how like there was many kinds of structures and forms and styles to the story, and I think, you know, in this particular case, it's trying to mirror something about the character's existential sort of experience, you know, of her condition. Other ones are about sort of, because there's a lot of underrepresented perspectives or unrepresented perspectives. And, you know, it was sort of like, you know, how do where would these pieces appear, you know? And I think this is also part of the question with in writing this story too. How can I access this particular point of view or this character's story? You know, and in other ones where, you know, there's like a one-sided interview where you see the interviewees answers, but not the questions, you know, to kind of comment on like how testimonies are structured, you know, and the power play that goes into the structuring of a testimony. And in that one, it's kind of like about, you know, how these texts or stories become a battlefield for different viewpoints, you know, that battle it out to kind of claim or to seize the narrative, you know, of history that's being presented. And so there are like different ones like that, you know, where like these are bigger issues. I think in this one, it's less so because it's not necessarily a particular underrepresented perspectives necessarily. It's a child, and there are other children in the book. And, you know, the idea is that if you look at all of the children narratives, it will start to form a different kind of pattern and illuminate, hopefully, different themes around, you know, because children play a very particular role in the collection that has to do with ties to the future, or that juncture between the present and the future trajectory, where there's maybe multiple possibilities, and the children kind of stand in the juncture right between these forking roads. So, you know, and then I think the other thing I might say about the happiness part, I think echolocation is probably the one that I enjoyed writing the most, because, you know, I was able to kind of, there was more joy in writing the sentences compared to other pieces and other styles that I was working with for those, you know, and so it's it's kind of a bleak book in the end. But I think that, it's not so much about the hope, but like where our individual sort of power might lie, and what we might do about it. And I think one of the things, Sharyn, I think, and maybe Stephanie, you might have mentioned too, like this idea of the wisdom part, understanding something may give us an opportunity to, make changes in different ways, whether it's on an individual level or a collective level. And, this kind of how the individual is linked to the collective. I think that was another big question in the book. And in this case, in echolocation, I think it's, this is a little child asking these big questions, and yet this is so fundamental to our understanding of ourselves as human beings, and maybe what the meaning of it all is, because it could end, or maybe it won't, but either way, we're all gonna eventually like die or whatever it is, and so I think we all have to make meaning. And this sort of story is partially also about why we tell stories, and going back to Tamarah, what you were saying about like, how we tell that story, because that's the only way that one can kind of make meaning out of anything, really, whether it's ourselves or our world, and so the centrality of storytelling to our existence as humans, and this kind of like transgenerational sort of responsibility, maybe, to asking these questions and maybe trying to find answers, whether it's individual or as a collective.
That's a big chore.
It really is.
But it's one that we all have to do. We have to take responsibility. Personal agency is what you brought up, and it is something that we all have to do. We all have to figure it out. I think the way you bring in some contemporary issues with the past issues and saying, okay, how do you put these together to make sense? And then how do you go forward from that? Maybe that's a kind of happiness in a way. Maybe making sense of it is a kind of happiness. Yes, Chuck?
I just have a question that's somewhat Buddhist. Is there a danger in the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
In the Buddhist tradition, Soto Zen, which is what I practice, one of the practices is to try not to try simply to experience what is there without adding anything to it, without trying to possess it, without trying to make it my story. Is it possible just to experience the world without language, without the shaping influence of story forms, but just to be? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that the story sort of, the character, I think, asks something of that, like what are the alternative forms of understanding the world? And I don't know that she necessarily goes to this, or I don't know that the story itself goes to this idea of, is silence or, just like we is that the only alternative, but certainly I think she asks sort of like, what if we understand the world more like an echolocation where it's clicks, or with, where it requires so much more listening to each other, and so I think that's a really good question about like the alternative of maybe going into silence and not telling stories, but then what would that mean in terms of civilization and its meaning, and sending that signal out into the vast universe, in the effect of when we're gone,
She talks about the mind's eye too. You talk about that. And that's a whole new other type of knowing, as Jackie calls it, the mind's eye, which isn't based on the Wikipedia,
right?
On the scientific type of knowledge that Maya is pulling from.
Yeah.
So that ties in with what you were saying, Chuck, I think, too. The mind's eye. knowledge.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the dichotomy between the Western instrumentalist, manipulative approach to reality through the scientific method and empiricism, as opposed to what she is saying about listening. Listening as the primary way in which we allow ourselves to experience the world. Do you think the instrumentalist Western vision is responsible for the cycles of violence and World War II?
I mean, it's hard to say if it's responsible, because I feel that, Japan certainly took up this notion, like it definitely, I mean, it had its own imperial history that was very much based on the Western model, and within Japan, there are these different philosophical schools of thought that are at logheads with the Enlightenment project. So like in Western tradition, I think there's a lot of like critiques of what in the Enlightenment project. In Japan, there are critiques of that too, and there are critics who use more Eastern philosophies and religious thought to kind of mount these critiques. I don't know about responsible, because we're getting into the territory of like how much of this is human nature, trying to secure resources, or keep out diseases, or I mean, there are sort of human things that we try to do to survive, but then there's ways in which, for that reason or whatever the reason may be, humans also weaponize stories, or weaponize reasoning methods, or weaponize information or knowledge, or any of these things towards control of other people or subjugation of other people. So I don't know if it's necessarily responsible. I mean, I think that everyone has responsibility down to the individual, in different ways. And I think I think the collection itself sort of asks, each story sort of asks, like, within your own context, like, where's your agency and where's your responsibility, and what are we doing about it, and are these the best, is this the best thing that we can do, like, where is the problem really, does it lie in these policies, or does it lie in these like laws, or does it lie in something more structural, in which case, like, are we all implicated in this system, and like, what can we each do, and so these are kind of the larger sort of questions that I don't have an answer to, and I think that the book as a whole is trying to pose, and ask these questions, because I think it's helpful for all of us to think about it together, from various viewpoints.
Right. I don't think you have to have an answer, but if you raise the question and, shatter people's presuppositions and, their assumptions, and make them think in a different way, that's a service that fiction can provide.
Yeah.
I think Ava had a question or a comment.
Yes. Hold on. I have to hop off for my 12 o'clock. This 2 minutes late. Zoom is a CLE class. But anyway, I'm thankful for this session, because it really helped me to understand this echolocation story. And Asako explained that the whole book, that the inherited book, is about the history and World War II, the impact of World War II on the current generations, next generation, but each story is autonomous as well. So that make me put this echolocation into that bigger picture, to understand these two kids and the characters in this story. Definitely, this story is packed with information, packed with the characters, packed with the symbolism and the myth. Like Sharyn said, the fountain, they stare at the fountain, but I don't know what fountain. It seems that's the only peaceful thing in the whole story. they are so disturbed. These two kids are disturbed, and and worried about that on the airplane, thousands feet high, and what would happen, but nothing happened in the end. But just like a couple of people here made the comments, threw the questions into it and ask questions and let readers to sort them out. That's quite a technique. And and also there are so many conflicts as well. Dad and mom kind of believe in reasonings, and mom doesn't trust humans, yet this boy believes in fate because he was born in on the Friday 13th. Buddhism, I don't, but Friday and 13th must be representing something in the Buddhism, and he believes in fate, and parents not. And also a couple of okay, click, the language click. I thought it's a chanting, it's like a Buddhism chanting, and provide some peace, but definitely there's no peace in the story. And she observes, she listens, it's echoes. She observes, and whatever she understands and heard is an echo from the locations. So I don't think a click does provide any understanding or peace in her. Anyway, I have to say, wow, what a story. Location or dislocated, that's how I read it. Okay, bye. I have to leave. Jump to another one.
Bye. Glad to see you. Wow. I followed that.
I thought it was very interesting. Thank you.
It was. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Certainly stimulates our thinking.
I think that's what she wanted to do. Maybe stimulate us for the next year. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Asako?
Well, I'm just, thank you for reading it so deeply and engaging with it, because, and, this is a pleasure because, like, as a writer, you don't necessarily always get to hear what readers might have made of something that you've written, and you have one idea in your head, but you don't know how this is translating, and so it's always just a pleasure to hear what everybody had to make of it, So Sharyn, thank you so much for, having me on, and everybody, thank you for coming and really reading the story and the collection. I mean, what's next is great. I mean, it's just really packed full of amazing stories. So I don't know, I'm just really grateful to be part of it. So.
Well, you are part of it, and it is a great story. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So glad to hear from you.
Okay.
Okay. Hey, goodbye, everybody.
Okay.
Tamara, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was just saying goodbye. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. I didn't want to cut you off if you were saying something.
No,
Okay.
I'm not going to do that. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.